because I've been through, pastoring a church so long, you've been through all the arguments. Where somebody's going to say, well, what about our 501c3 status? You know that, you've heard that, I'm sure, right? Because somebody always is going to raise that issue, right? And the thing is that we got to not be afraid of those things that tend to hold us in check. So you should be asking, what about Hagee's 501c3 status, right? Every time Netanyahu, for example, comes to the United States, Netanyahu goes down to his church in San Antonio, Texas, and speaks, and raises up a political agenda, and nobody ever raises a question about his 501c3 status. It is only us that get paralyzed by this idea. And so what happens if they come and take your tax-exempt status? What happens, right? And the issue is, I got an organization right now we call Faith Strategies. And Faith Strategies is a collection of clergy that are brought together to deliberately engage in political agitation. You're brought to the table by invitation. And we build on that table of invitation. And we deliberately decided that we weren't going to be nonprofit. We were going to pay taxes. Because we're going to jack up folk, right? And we were going to be clear about that. That's what we were engaged in, jacking up folk. And so we have an entity that is clearly not a nonprofit entity, but a political entity that's clearly a political entity, that is a collection of clergy.
I've done a little study about 501c3, and what I understand is you can get behind issues all you want, and it's not going to threaten your nonprofit status.
Right.
The only time you get in trouble is if you actually endorse, get behind the pulpit and endorse a political candidate. But you can rail all you want about the issues that mean something to you, and not be threatened.
Sure, I've endorsed candidates behind the pulpit.
Oh, okay. Well, that's great.
I've endorsed candidates, and I've said who I wouldn't vote for in a million years.
Yeah, now that.
And invite you to do the same.
The Catholic Church has done that too. So.
Yeah, the Catholic
And the evangelical church has done that. That's what this is all about.
And I've never heard of a case where they actually came after
And
him.
did anything.
I've never heard anyone had their 501c3 taken away. Not yet, anyway.
Well, and look at the laws for political action committees and Supreme Court rulings even that untap
Right.
unlimited money for political action. So it's
This is another aside. I was arrested in June, 9 of us, so a total of 9, for praying in front of the Supreme Court. And we spent a night in jail, and basically spent a night and a day in jail, because they deliberately lost us in the system. We were shackled, and we were in leg irons, and for most of that time. We had to agree, in order to be released, that we had to surrender our passports. So my passport is still in the custody of the federal court. And though I will not have a trial until May, I have to call in or report every week to the federal court my whereabouts. So it's almost like I'm on parole before I even had a trial. Right? I mean, so that's what's going on right now. So it's we're still sort of winding our way slowly through trial for praying in front of the Supreme Court.
So you were just, a group of you were standing in front of the Supreme Court praying and got arrested?
Yes.
I sent out an article. Would you please say your great line about why you were praying on the Supreme Court because of the Supreme Court? I don't want to say it. Your line.
I don't remember what that
The Supreme Court was preying upon our rights, so we decided to pray on the steps of the Supreme Court.
Those are things you say in the
Graylan.
Yeah.
But what was the actual charge? Because they can't charge you for praying. What was the charge that they issued?
Parading.
Without a permit.
Parading.
Without a
Parade.
9 of you in front of the Supreme Court.
Tell us about the 9 of you, and tell us about your. I know that you've written about and spoken about your night in jail. I mean, tell us, flesh it out a little bit more for us. What you?
Well, it was Liz Theo Harris, who is the co-chair with Reverend Barber. It was
Were these
Lamar-
clergy or?
It was clergy
These are the clergy
Right. that were arrested with
yeah,
me.
but you created this group that is for profit. This
Well,
is
no,
part of that group?
this came out of the Poor People's Campaign.
Oh, okay, all
Okay.
right. Mhm.
And so the day that the court ruled that Ohio could purge its voting rolls was the day that we went and prayed in front of the court. And so we're, out of that, arrested. We ended up being handcuffed in the basement of the Supreme Court with our hands literally behind our back for 5 hours. And then from that, I leaned over to one of the preachers. I said, they get ready to jack us up. He said, what do you mean? And I said, and just as I said that, the police chief of the Supreme Court came in and said, I'm charging you with this, and I want you to understand that you made a fatal mistake. You stepped on my side of the street. Right? And I said to him, we're lost in the system. Which was true, we were lost in the system. So we were taken over to DC Central cell block.
Excuse me, you said the police force of
They
the
have their own.
They have their own.
Supreme Court.
Supreme Court has their own freaking police court?
Yep.
Police force?
Just like Congress.
Really?
How about that?
So the chief police of the Supreme Court.
That's right.
Oh, I love it. Go ahead.
So they took us over to
Layers
DC
and
Central cell block and put us there in cells. And cells there are basically a very tiny metal cell made out of metal and very, very dirty. The beds is a metal shelf with holes drilled in it, and that's it. And it's roach infested and rat infested. So they're crawling all over the walls, the floors, the place that you're supposed to be sleeping in and all that type of stuff. So that's what we dealt with all night long in terms of that cell. So in many ways I was glad when they came to transport us out. Again, they put us back into leg irons and handcuffs and transported us over to Superior Court, DC Superior Court. And DC Superior Court, the lockup there was, since we had been in hell all night, was like, the lockup there was like heaven. Except there was 40 of us all in leg irons, right? And that were being held, waiting to go to trial. And then one of the things happened, which was one of those moments that was just a moment of sheer spirit, where this young man hears me talking to the other preachers, and he comes over to me. When I say young man, he's probably maybe 17, maybe. And he looks at me and he says, "Are you a minister?" And I said, "Yeah." And then tears, his eyes fill up with tears, and he says, "Will you pray with me?" And I said, "Of course." And I took his hand and we started praying. And then when we finished, it dawned on me that he, out of his desperation, he was probably the bravest. And so I made an announcement to the whole cell. I said, "Look, y'all," I said, "I just prayed with this young man." I said, "But here's a pastor, there's a pastor there, there's another pastor. Anybody want to pray, we'll pray with you." The whole cell came over and joined in a circle of prayer. And so you got and I'm watching the court officials, because they're trying to figure out what in the hell is getting ready to go on, right? Whether it's getting ready to be an uprising, right? That type of stuff, right? But but what happened in the midst of there was that after we finished that prayer, I mean, every clergy in there made the same comment: how all of this rough and tough veneer of all of these guys just fell off. And all of a sudden we were hearing about their troubles at home, their troubles not getting a job. Can you help me with this? Can you help me do that? Just from that human moment. And so we ended up having a whole conversation with those guys in the lockup all the rest of the day. And then they decided we were in the wrong court. And so then they put us back in shackles and manacles and transport us over to federal court. This was like 3 in the afternoon. We went over to federal court. So now we're back in lockup in federal court, waiting to be seen by a judge. and the clock is just ticking. And so this is the next day now from the day of the arrest, y'all. So at 8 p.m. we get to a judge. And so they bring us into the courtroom. It was so interesting. They brought us into the courtroom chained up. And we had all these clergy that were waiting for us, and they were like in utter shock that they brought us out like that. And so we had to remind myself, well, you saw those chains. You didn't see the body chains we were in, because we were in body chains as well. So our ordeal ended somewhere that evening after the 8 o'clock judge. But I'll tell you another story that's related to that. And again, it's sort of signs of God's grace. I'm coming out of federal court. All my stuff is in a plastic bag, because you got to dump all your pockets. I realized I don't have any money. I didn't bring any credit cards. And I just flagged down a cab.
Yeah.
And so I turned to somebody on the street and I said, you know, if you give me an address and number, I'll get you the money back if you can help me with this. And the cab driver says, no, I'm not charging you, get in the cab. And I said, but I don't have any money. He says, get in the cab. He said, I'm going to take you wherever you're going. Right? So he took me all the way to my home. And it was a cab driver that had been at the Al Quds rally that I spoke at.
Oh, wow.
Right? A few days prior.
Jerusalem.
Right? A few days prior. And so he remembered me from speaking at the rally. So I'm just sitting there thinking of all the cabs I could have flagged down. I flagged down that one. And for me, that was sort of just signs, again, of God's grace saying, I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to take care of you. And the other thing, and I've said this to my congregation because it is like I saw your expression around the roaches and the rats and stuff. And that's my reaction. That's my reaction. But all of a sudden, I understand what it means by a peace that passes all understanding. Because what descended on me in that cell that night was this envelope of peacefulness and tranquility. And so I sat there all night long, through it all, not feeling even the desperation of it. Not feeling the discomfort, killing roaches, of course, but not.
He's no St. Francis.
I just want to be clear, right? I'm not all saintly, right? It's not like, get away from me, right?
He crushed those little bastards, right?
That's right, but
You had to have some outlets to let the air out.
Sorry, Graylan, I'm sorry.
but there was this peace. And again, that was a sign of God's grace through it all. God's grace through it all.
Thanks for expanding on the story. I know this story, and I knew that it would touch a lot of hearts. Come on, folks. This is our time with our guests.
I'll make a comment and then comment on it. You know, I'm amazed at myself in that supposedly this well-read person, but I'm 67, I'm 66, and I went with Michael on this life-transforming trip to Palestine in 2012. And getting ready for it, I'm ashamed to say, in a sense, that when reading Mark Braverman's Fatal Embrace, he kept referring to this letter from a Birmingham jail. How in the hell did I get to be 60 at the time and have never read that? And then I've been now just with him for my third time to Palestine, and so read everything, I can in the last 6 years. But because it was the 50th anniversary of Beyond Vietnam in spring of just a year ago, a year and a half ago, 2017,
That's right.
I had never heard of the giant triplets of racism, now neoliberalism as it's called, crony capitalism, and militarism. I'd never heard of that. How can you? Anyways, I mean, it speaks volumes of, I guess, in a sense of where we are and where a white, I mean, it's just amazing to me. And now maybe because of what I read, the giant triplets plus ecological devastation, that's the 4 that you're doing with the poor people's campaign, I mean, it comes up all the time. You know, and it's everywhere, and it's 50 years old, and it's what's killing us. And yet, I mean, and I read more than probably, I mean, and yet, so like, where do we, so then one of the last, so I thought of this when knew I was gonna get to meet you, to ask you this, and then it turns out it's one of King's last speeches or so. Where do we go from here? I mean, like, you know, I'm late to the game, but.
Well, you have something you want to say?
I guess what I was gonna say, that this Trumpy stuff the last 2 years is really just kind of bringing it out. I mean, I guess I would say from what Palestine taught me was I was passionate about Palestine, but then it just blew my mind about all this other stuff. Now it's expanded, and now I realize that this crap that's been going on for the last 2 years just kind of brings it to the surface of what you've been working on your whole life, of what King talked about 50 years ago, right? I mean, this is nothing new, this stuff.
And one of the things to be clear about what King and Malcolm, W.B. Du Bois, you know, Mary Bethune-McLeod, many of the folks have been dealing with, has been the structure and the economics of racism and white supremacy in the nation. That has been the hallmark that has, in a sense, enriched the nation from its inception. I was mentioning earlier there was a book that I was suggesting that folks take a look at. It's a thick book, kind of dense. A guy named Baptist, I think it's David Baptist, I think. It's called The Half Has Never Been Told. And he takes a look at the whole economic system of slavery and how it really served as the economic and political backbone to the nation. And in many ways, you discover that we repeat the same things over and over again. You know, it's like, let's go back, you know, the Episcopal Church was the Church of England arriving on these shores. And the folks who populated the Church of England on these shores, they were largely the huge plantation owners that the king had awarded massive tracts of land that could not be worked except by slaves. That was the only way they could be profitable, right? Because it was massive tracts of land. And so it helped to fuel the importation of slaves, right? Not only in North America, but also in the Caribbean as well. And so one of the things that happens, however, is that along about the time of the Louisiana Purchase, definitions of slavery changes. At one point you were enslaved, you were known as maybe a blacksmith, maybe a housekeeper, maybe a nanny. Those were the descriptions in which you were sold under. Louisiana Purchase, all of a sudden you became a hand to pick cotton. And it became an economic formula of how much cotton a hand could pick. And bank loans were predicated upon that, in terms of how much cotton could a hand pick. The Indian Removal Act of Andrew Jackson was to free up land for more plantations. So it was to carry off genocide against one people to create a genocide on another people. Right? And the whole Louisiana Purchase just basically expanded slave plantation territory. Most folks didn't even build homes. Most folks operated labor camps to pick cotton. In fact, a lot of those folks were in the North, right? Operating labor camps and making investments. That part and parcel of the history. I mean, one of the things that Barbara talks about is the third Reconstruction. I mean, just think about the reaction every single time. I mean, it's like you have the close of the Civil War. You have an opportunity for one time to begin to create radical enfranchisement in the country. And as one person and one vote is enforced. It's enforced by military, but it's enforced. And so in places like South Carolina, you got so many blacks that have been imported that they are the majority population and they're able to elect folks. North Carolina, the same thing. Right? Mississippi, to some degree, had imported so many folks that you had one person, one vote. Folks went to Congress, folks became judges, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, that was turned back very quickly, right? Less than 10 years later, it's flipped. How is this flipped? It's flipped by terrorism, right? And so the lynchings, the burnings, the mutilations, right? Preventing folks to come to the polls, and then a presidential election. A presidential election that breaks down between Tilden and Hayes, right? And then and Hayes reaches the compromise that I'll go to the White House on the promise of withdrawing the last remaining Union troops from the South, which then allowed for all the Jim Crow laws to come into place once again. And then that continues for almost 100 years, right? And so it's really King and all them come out of that whole experience of history, of the clock being turned back. In fact, there's one church, which was First Congregational Church in Atlanta, that was created deliberately as an integrated congregation of blacks and whites in the middle of Atlanta, Georgia. That's where Andy Young is a member at. When Jim Crow comes back in, it is illegal. It is illegal to be in the same church. So the church has to make a decision. And the decision that the white folks make out of attempting to be in solidarity is that they would give the building and the assets to the blacks. And that they would have the church and they would go elsewhere. And so that's why First Congregational Church is a black church today. It's because
So
it
they
comes
literally could not worship together.
right.
They'd have been thrown in jail.
Yes.
And it was laws on the book.
Laws on the books. It was laws on the books that particularly after Nat Turner's rebellion that said that any Negro, slave or free, who called themselves a minister of the gospel could be hung. Because it was going to be out of that sector that revolution and uprising was going to be fomented. When Dylan Roof went into that church in South Carolina and killed people in Bible study, that was on the anniversary of the Denmark Vesey uprising that came out of that church. That church had been burnt before. He knew the anniversary. The media never understood the anniversary.
Oh, well, I missed that piece.
And but he understood the anniversary, and that's why he assaulted that church on that day. 1898, North Carolina. You have a coup d'etat. And when I say a coup d'etat, you have a fusion government in North Carolina, a fusion campaign of whites and blacks operating together to try to bring together the vote. And so they elect in Wilmington, North Carolina, a town council and mayor, this fusion government that pulled